It's the end of day 10 of my AI sprint, and there's a lot of exciting updates. First off, we've got Starlens. Had a great launch on Product Hunt. We got over 180 upvotes, and we also got featured in Product Hunt's email. So that was a really nice surprise. And I checked the cache, and there's been over 1,600 unique requests already at this point. So I'm very proud of the first project that came out of the AI sprint. And I also got to meet with Oskar from Workflows. And we had a great brainstorming session on what we should build as we collaborate. So we're going to be building an email tool that takes a domain name and returns public emails available for it. We're going to use AI for some of the fuzzy language things around that and for some of the scraping use cases. Later in this video, I've got a cut down of us during our brainstorming session as we came up with that idea. And we should probably start on that next week. There's been major progress on my Notion database assistant, which is the project I picked up after launching Starlens. At this point, I've got a working version that works with a knowledge base in Notion. So I can ask it about individual records and it will search and return those. It's got multiple tools, one for searching the database itself and one for searching within a page itself. It's handling the peculiarities of the Notion API. It might not hold up for 25,000 records when you're doing semantic search across those, but so far it's been great once I've added the search within a page tool. I've also gotten it to not hallucinate, but the real, I think, headline here is that I made a workflow that makes other workflows. So I basically took that knowledge-based workflow and I copied its workflow JSON. I fed that into a React agent in N8N. And then I also fed in the database schema of another database and it worked. So today I posted on our N8N Slack about that and had a few folks interested in that. So I cloned our support team's knowledge base, and on the second attempt to generate, it worked. On the first one, it didn't. What I'm working on now is to improve the percentage rate of generation by having some validation on the workflow JSON that comes out. And if it fails some of that generation, looping it back into the AI and having it try again. That's what I'll probably show in the next update. So for the rest of this video, check out some of the more detailed highlights from the last couple of days.
Hi, I'm Oskar. I run a YouTube channel called Workflows. I share tips, tricks, and tutorials about workflow automation, especially with N8N.
So I've been tracking some ideas in here, but I was wondering, before we jump into that, Oskar, is there anything that you've wanted to build that you maybe didn't have time for, that you'd like some support on, especially when it comes to AI use cases?
I actually have the iOS note prepared. If you want, I can share this too. So I have several ideas. There are 4 of them. 3 are like AI-based, and the 4th one is like quite a simple app, I would say. Mm-hmm. Basically, the idea number 1 is something that I was working on my early days with N8N. Back then, there were no advanced AI tools. I think we can level up this with AI. What the tool is supposed to do is you enter the domain you want to research. For example, in this case, it's workflows.com. And in the output, you should receive the list of emails that are publicly available. So this is super simple. I see the AI agent going through websites, search results, and retrieving potential email addresses that can be used for various purposes, which is for research. Mm-hmm. So this is the idea number 1. Here's the number 2 option, which is emoji API. Sometimes I think it may be useful when you have plain text and you want to enrich this with emojis, or you just you are searching or want to automatically search for some kind of emoji and you don't know which one to use. Nice. So you can do it programmatically. Mm-hmm. And I have it in the form of API, but we can create some kind of UI for this. There are some endpoints like emoji to text, text to emoji, and so on and so forth. Or for example, the search for emoji. The third idea is something you already built something on the top of GitHub. Some apps, for example, N8N, are releasing weekly or quite often, and it's sometimes quite difficult to catch up on all the changes that have been made in a specific tool, specific repository. So basically doing an automation that will create for you on a weekly basis some kind of brief of the changes that have been made in the repositories you are following it can be super cool to pick up those features and send you like the weekly digest.
I think that's super useful as well, because I could see there being various settings to modify like level of detail, errors only. I really like this idea as well, because I think it's has a lot of utility. And there's probably whole products that do this already. And I love the examples where we can show how we can recreate certain solutions do as a whole product in end. A lot of end users use different tools and packages and open source products. This is probably like a real pain point as well.
Totally.
So I guess the question is, you've made our job harder, Oskar, because you got 4 great ideas here. And I think we should probably just focus on one of these 4 ideas, because these are some great ideas. But I think the hard problem now is which to pick.
Oh, yeah.
So with that in mind, I can provide quite a lot of build support, because for the rest of the month, I'm just focused on this full time. Well, what's your schedule like? How much time could you dedicate to collaborating on something?
I'm recently quite tight on work, but I think, doing something about like hour to 2 hours a day should be doable. I think this project should not be super demanding.
Yeah. I think also the goal here is like, we're trying to create some stuff that people could recreate themselves or download these templates and tweak from there. If we make it too complicated, it'll be a little less accessible. What's your favorite?
I would go with the first one, because I see the proper value for a lot of companies here doing their research and so on. It should be relatively quick to implement, especially with an A10. And so this one I would say is my top pick. The second one, some kind of emoji feature, API or an app. It would be also cool. The other two are also great ideas. With idea number 4, you need to create a more extended infrastructure, because you need some kind of scripts to process those images. When it comes to the idea 3, you already did something with GitHub. So we don't want to be on automatic. So I think going with number 1 or 2 is the sweet spot.
And so for email, let's talk about the 2 ideas quickly. So for email spy, I see that it could have a few different data sources for this information. Maybe that's configurable. What were the data sources you were considering before I bias you?
My pick, like the initial pick, and most probably the one that will provide the highest number of results and data, is simple Google search results. And going through the websites, picking the content from them, extracting emails. There are exceptions here, because in many cases, email addresses may not be in an obvious format like here.
Oskar, like the app and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. So we have like plenty, possibilities here that both, custom scripts and AI can play a significant role. I think search results and going one by one through the websites is the most important. We can most probably use some kind of open databases, which we can connect with some kind of custom script with Puppeteer, wherever it's available for those terms and so on, because we don't want to go to the shady zone. I think going with the Google search results and maybe something additional would be cool. But I don't have a specific, data sources here in my besides search result.
So how we could structure it is it's modular. Maybe one of the tools or sub workflow tool, we'll figure that out, is the scraping of the site, or we'll Google search, right? And then we'll see how long that takes. We could potentially add another tool to it. So we can also show users how they could add other tools. Maybe someone pays for People Data Labs, which provides this kind of information. If they want to check there first and then scrape additionally. And then what we could also build is whatever sources that you get, it deduplicates it. So if 2 of the sources come back with the same thing, I'll put the same one. What I like about it is if we build this as a backend, it's headless. And then with sub workflows, I could in 10 minutes create a form trigger workflow for people to demo it easily. And we launch it with that as well. Slack bots, Teams bots, whatever. It's at that point, I think we could ship it as a headless workflow with maybe 1 or 2 example workflows on how to consume it. And then from there, hopefully, people build their own ones and kind of remix it their own way.
Yeah, totally. Basically, this is like, I think building it in that whole, it's like I think this is the perfect workflow to build like in the form of, some kind of request response, API, style, because, eventually most of this data will be based in some kind of, spreadsheet or other database, so people don't want to like go through copy pasting from some kind of interface. Of course, it's nice to have, but, eventually like going with the API way, it's like super handy.
I think it decouples it. We see it in e-commerce. Headless e-com is all the rage these days because your front end, sometimes it's a mobile app, sometimes it's an app's flexible. But also with the advent of AI, nice mug, by the way. I like that. That on the mug, that's Clippo, the unofficial, it's unofficial, and mascot. Back to the point. So with the advent of AI, right, and AI agents, and it being easier for people to build those themselves, I feel like building in a headless way makes it also future-proof to be used by other AI agents. If it's a RESTful endpoint and multi-agentic workflows is something that we're seeing, because even with Ava, the assistant that's on cloud right now, it uses a multi-agent approach because we found that one agent solving all problems is a much harder thing to do. It's less accurate. So it's better to instead triage what the problem is and have specific agents for specific types of problems. And so this could, in future be used by something like that. Basically, do we see any reason to not build it in a headless way?
Absolutely not. I think like building it a headless node is like a perfect approach.
And then what we could also do once it's out, Oskar has a great tutorial on using basically to put a little service on top of your end-to-end workflows to really make them a production API endpoint. Perhaps we could launch this as a service on Product Hunt, but I recommend we build it first, see how it's looking, and then we could get together and figure out how to launch it. How does that sound?
Yeah, totally. I'm looking forward to this.
Cool.
Yeah, you have a great time, building, and ciao.
A few moments later.
I'm starting on my chat with Notion database template in here. And so what this is going to do is allow users to use the end-to-end chat trigger to chat with a Notion database, but not as a vector store. We're going to use an AI agent, and we're going to teach it how to interact with a Notion database as a tool. One thing I want to do with this feature is make it a bit more sophisticated to where the user just has to type in the ID of this database when they're setting it up. The workflow will dynamically fetch these things, create the schemas that it needs to in the AI agent, so users don't have to remap that all themselves. A neat thing that I'm doing is using ChatGPT to create a lot of the mock data when I'm testing things. So for example, give you a look at this. I'm creating an AI assistant, propose some knowledge source types. So it was even giving me ideas on what this use case can be. I really like this automated knowledge base one. I think that's a very relatable use case. Probably a lot of people have knowledge sources that they'd like to interact with an AI agent. And then we went through the columns that it should have. And then from there, basically fleshed that out to create my mock data in JSON. Because I was going to first try to copy into Notion, and I figured I'm going to do this with N8N because it'll be faster. Where I'm at now is I've created my different tables in Notion. I've connected to my Notion. So when you're using N8N, mine's called Max Bots. It's already added, so it's here, but make sure it's added there. And then in my workflow, this is the workflow that I started building for my Notion database assistant. But here I'm just creating a quick little flow just to load this data in. So I added a set node. From here, I double clicked it, I hit the edit button, and I pasted in what I got from ChatGPT. You got to make sure that you have objects in a top level array. That's how ChatGPT happened to output this, but if it doesn't, you'll have to instruct ChatGPT to do that or add these in yourselves. So as you can see, we've got this all in there. So I'll click on here, I'll add Notion. We want to add a database page. We'll select from list. It's called my knowledge source. And so for the title of the document, something to remember is each Notion page needs to have a title by default, but you can rename that column. So I've called it question. And so for title, I'm going to drag and drop the question. So if we got 14 items coming in, so I'll expect to create 14 knowledge source entries in here. And then for the properties for this, let's see, for the answer, we'll drag and drop that in there. And we'll add another property, and we'll do this for all of them. We'll add another property. And for here, we want to map the department. Now, department I have modeled as tags, so we don't have drift here. And this is a common case. By default, there's a dropdown, right? So if I pick operations, I can't necessarily map to this. If I flip to expressions, we can see that the tags are just in plain text like this. So if I write operations with a capital letter here, this will match to that tag. So what we could do is drag and drop this in here. And then we just got to double check in my data that we have the same capitalization. Now, of course, we could pre-process that if we wanted to, but since this is mock data, I have a bit more flexibility. So IT in capitals, HR in capitals, operations, and product. That is how we have it in here. Great. It will map to the department select type in Notion. In the Notion, we can see we're populating these. That's great. If I see in here, we're seeing they're all being added here. That's perfect. Now, I didn't add too much prompting to ChatGPT on being more consistent with my tags or something, so that might be something that we could improve. But since I'm building a template that should work with any schema, it doesn't really matter for this use case. So now we've successfully mapped those in, and we can build my actual workflow now that we have some representative mock data.
6.5 hours later.
I'm building out the AI assistant. You can see there's an example of it I just ran here. I asked, what is our VPN? And the workflow responded with correct information and also the relevant pages. So through chat prompting, I was able to get it to always reference the pages it used to inform this answer. If I click on these, we can see those are valid links that link to the particular document it used to inform its answer. So how does it work? If I go in here, it starts off with a chat trigger. This node handles this UI interface. It's also generating a session ID, which gets fed into my AI agent step. Now, I haven't attached memory yet, but once I do, along with the session ID, it will allow messages in a thread to be fed in as a thread to the AI. Because right now, if I ask another question, it runs another execution of this workflow. Whatever gets outputted here is returned to the chat, and it's stateless. So if I send another message, it won't know that this happened. To do that, from where my workflow is right now, I basically would just need to attach some memory, and it would work out of the box. Because I'm using a chat trigger, if you were using a different kind of trigger, for example, webhook, you would need to be sending in your own session ID. And as long as by the time that data comes in here with a top-level session ID key, the AI agent will pick that up. So what's happening in these two nodes, I'm using the edit fields nodes, and they're basically just setting some static data here. So if I go in here, it's setting my database name, which I use later on. And I often have a set node like this after my trigger node with certain variables like this, because it makes it easier if I want to swap my trigger node later. Let's say I swap this to a webhook trigger, or I want a webhook trigger to also be able to run this workflow, right? You can have multiple trigger nodes in an end-to-end workflow. What's going to happen now is when I need to reference these variables from this node, let's say in here, right? So I'm referencing the name of the database, and that's not the Notion name of it, it's the custom name that I set my set node. If I change my triggers now, this won't be affected. So that's just a good strategy for workflows, is to add some sort of variables node right at the beginning. The next node that I add here basically resets the structure going into the agent to what it was going in here. So it makes it look like this again. Because if I go in here, the input data is from the previous node, right, which is setting that database name. So I'm basically just resetting that. And how that works, it's really nice with this drag and drop feature. I can basically take this, for example, drop it here, and it's set the key and the value there. Then that information gets fed into my AI agent. Let's open that up quickly. In here, I have it set to a tools agent because I am using a tool. I'm using the Search Notion database tool, which I created. It's an HTTP request tool. And then for the text, we're using define below. We could, in this case, just use take from previous node automatically because it's in the right structure going in. It's the same structure as from the chat trigger. But I was experimenting with adding some suffixes, even things like I love you at the end. It wasn't really working. I don't recommend it. But this is a way that you could combine what the user is actually sending with some other strings. And then for the system message, I actually use ChatGPT to help set this up. Essentially, there's role, behavior, error handling, and output sections. And it's really the output here where I was kind of iterating. You can see in the end here, do not output links twice, only in relevant pages section. I sort of slapped this in because it showed the relevant links twice. Adding this, I haven't seen that since. So I was iterating on this quite a bit. And then we have the chat model itself. Nothing too crazy in here. I've just got a shorter timeout set right now that I added from the options because I was finding that if it was taking a long time, it was failing and it was attempting to use my tool multiple times. So I just set that to lower to reduce how long I'm waiting and how many tokens I'm spending while I was configuring the HTTP request tool here. Then I have an HTTP request tool I added from the nodes panel here. And if I open this up, it's got a description. So use this tool to search again, I'm referencing the name of that database. So far, I've been finding it very helpful to use the exact same name, especially when it's in two different contexts. So if I'm referencing something in my tool, I try to, as much as possible, have the exact same name in my AI node. Because at the end of the day, these LLMs, they're finding weights between certain characters and text, right? So I'm not an expert at this, but I assume it's better to use the exact same name there. This is a post request I need to make. Here's the URL with the database ID. For a lot of this stuff, I was using ChatGPT, just asking it, hey, give me a call request or give me body parameters for so-and-so call. We are using JSON below for specifying this. Previously, I was experimenting with let metal specify entire body. It was working some of the time, actually. So what I had done is just let model specify entire body and just piped in a lot of context on how the Notion API works here. But this approach to specify it and then use placeholders on what the AI is allowed to modify. So here, keyword is in curly brackets, and I've defined it as a placeholder below. This is what tells the AI that you can manipulate this part of the query. I've found that specifying this and locking down what the AI can do does lead to more predictable results. So we can see here, I've added two things for the AI to be able to control. The keyword itself, this is affecting the question property here. So that would be this one. Now, because Notion has a strict search, not a fuzzy search, I told the AI that it should think of this as a keyword. So search questions of the record, use one keyword at a time. I changed this because it was searching for more specific phrases and getting very few matches. So now it searches for something like VPN, pulls in all the issues around VPN and searches for those. So I think this strategy is going to work when you're talking about dozens and hundreds of records. It might be a little less efficient for thousands of them. But it also can search by tag. Here are the options for the tag. This is something I can automate because obviously users could update these tags, so I want to make that fresh. And then the important thing here, the way Notion works, is make sure this is an OR filter, or be conscious if you're doing an OR or an AND, because I had this set to AND and I was getting no results back. So another thing that I haven't done yet, but it could be useful, is when you get a no results query, copy that response from the output and perhaps as context for your AI, tell it in the description here what that looks like, because my AI wasn't able to identify that it was getting a no results query. It was seeing that it was a problem. Now, it wasn't a problem, there just was no results for that specific query, which could be good context for the AI to know so that it tries something different, perhaps a synonym. So that's definitely something that I could optimize there. Then what I did next, so that's the workflow working, is if we go to the project here, I created a workflow that takes a different Notion database as input, or the URL for it, and outputs using a React agent, a new workflow that works with that new schema. So let's try this out. Copy this, go here. So enter a Notion database URL. We see you even have a placeholder here. We'll copy this. Now, the nice thing is I set up some pretty quick error validation. So if I do this, so sorry, that doesn't look like a valid Notion database. If I send in a valid one, it's now generating. And while it does that, let me show you the workflows. In the chat trigger, the first thing that we do is try and fetch that Notion URL by URL. I pipe that in as an expression, and then I had GPT generate a match function. And what it does is this match function filters out anything that's not a valid Notion URL. So if the user types something like, here is my URL, this would still work. It wouldn't fail. It would just extract this. But if they type in something else that doesn't get extracted and this node errors out because this isn't a valid parameter, because I've got on error set to continue using error output, it outputs to here. And then in this node, I make sure I carry along the same session ID to return to this session. And then output is the key that the chat trigger expects. So any node that is the last node to execute, if it has an output, that's the value of that will be sent to the chat trigger. So I'm exploiting that very simply by just having a static message here. Sorry, that doesn't look like a valid Notion URL. We could add a switch node here, have some conditional logic checking that error. The error that comes out, you do get some key values on the type of error. And so I could have multiple static messages sent out to the user for better feedback. But since I'm still in build mode, I'll do some stuff like that later on. Let's check the workflow. Great, it's generated. So let's just copy that. Let's go to a new workflow. Let's save this. Let's open a new workflow. Let's paste it in. Okay, so it's a valid workflow JSON. And let's ask in this new database, it's about companies. Let's see which companies are from Germany. Which companies are from Germany? Da, 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 da. And there we have it. So no tricks. I ran this workflow. It took my original flow. It took the context of the new database schema and it outputted a valid workflow JSON. And if I just go into the generate workflow, what's happening is I get the Notion database. I strip that down a little bit because it has too much information. It's not so relevant. It's going into an AI, so we want it to not be too heavy. I then have the workflow JSON from my previous workflow being outputted in a code node. I'm doing it in a code node because it itself is JSON. So I needed a way to not break that, right? And then in my AI agent, I have a prompt, modify this original workflow. Here's the new Notion database details. This is basically a schema that I got from the first node, the Notion node, the original workflow. We want to add 2 JSON string here to stringify that. And then a pretty simple prompt. You are an expert developer. There was some stuff on the JSON output because it was outputting it with line breaks and stuff. So I actually pasted in the broken JSON that it was sending into ChatGPT, asked it to give me a prompt modify to fix that, and it's been working so far. So yeah, we now have a workflow that's creating other workflows. I'm not so confident that it'll work for more complicated properties in Notion table now. So that's the next thing to test and basically tweak the prompt or give it a bit more context. So then we can launch basically a generator that takes my template, takes your table and outputs a ready-made working workflow for you where all you're going to have to do is swap out the credentials.
A few minutes later.
Our support team heard about the Notion database workflow, and they also heard that it can be cloned with AI. I just duplicated their support knowledge base. This is NetEnd's official support knowledge base that a support team is using. I just duplicated it and I just added my MaxBot as a connection. What we can do now is copy this here, open it in a new tab. If I copy this, paste it in, the workflow is now scraping the schema for this here. So name, tags, updated by all these different ones. Let's see if this works. It does not know, at least from my workflow, about this structure for checkboxes. Maybe it can figure it out. If not, I'll basically ask ChatGPT to output some context for each type of Notion property here for a database and see if that improves the results. Exciting stuff. Geez, if this works out of the box without any more tweaks, I'll be super chuffed. And if not, I reckon a few more tweaks and we'll get it to work. Okay, got the workflow. Let's copy it. What I can do next is also have this bot just create the workflow on the instance because we have an NetEnd node in NetEnd that can create workflows. So getting very inception-y. But let's create a new workflow. Let's name the workflow. Be good eggs. Assistant. Yeah. Let's paste it in. Okay. Valid workflow JSON. Let's just check this out real quick. Okay. Did not work. Although it did update the tags correctly, but not the JSON object. Let's give it one more go. looks like we've got a bit more work to do. Well, at least for it to work automatically for every single type of Notion database, which I think is quite a feat. And if I can get that done by end of day, I'm going to be thoroughly impressed. It's crazy to me, like this is being represented by these 3 dots, but what's happening under the hood while this is running always kind of humbles me. I've caught myself sometimes it's, taking 15 seconds. I'm like, geez, it's taking so long. And I'm thinking, wait a second. It's automatically generating a workflow JSON that can automate a process for you. Copy this, put in here, delete that, paste it in, and run it. How do I set up LDAP? Because we see LDAP is in the support base and it's in the name. So let's see. Yeah, it worked. Awesome. So we need to figure out the reliability of that a little bit. What I could try and do is have some validation checks. So we saw in the first example, it was just outputting body. So the first thing I'm going to try and do is create some checks that can check for that and basically reject that. We'll try first doing it outside the agent, so it's deterministic, maybe some kind of rejects check, checking for that part of the workflow, and we'll rerun the agent until it works because we saw that it does work. So that's going to be the first approach I try. But again, within 24 hours, I built a workflow that can understand a Notion database and another workflow that can take a different Notion database and customize that workflow to work for it. And I got that working right now 50 to 70% of the time. So let's increase that number. Great progress within 1 day, I reckon.
A few inches later.
I've updated the workflow to now also be able to search inside database records because the support team's records mostly had the content, the how-to stuff, the useful things were inside the page, not as properties in the Notion database. Now the agent can search across the Notion database with things like tags and names of things, so it can do that rather efficiently and not have to download every single page in the database. Then for ones that it thinks are relevant, for example, when the user asks to summarize something, it can search for that page itself and pull the blocks content in Notion from that page. I haven't even really formatted it too much, just stripped it down just a little bit inside the HTTP request tool. So here I'm optimizing response. I asked ChatGPT what the response from Notion looks like. Results is the relevant one, so I pop that in there. And then I asked GPT to which fields might. So what this stuff is doing here is Notion is sending back a heavier payload, and this is stripping it before it touches the LLM. So it's a more efficient way to pipe data into the LLM because it's sending some more relevant information. And I could probably optimize this further, but moving quickly, building in public, and using LLMs to build LLM-powered things. So let's give it a go. And then how LDAP, summarize it. And so now, and we'll see this in the preview on the right here. Yeah, it's called multiple tools. If I look at the tools, we can see that we searched the Notion database first for LDAP and tags, and this is using an OR, so it came up with anything with that. There was some responses there, looks like more than one. And then the model ran again, and then the model decided to search inside database record. So it used the second tool, which is why it had this context to summarize this information. And if we open it up, we can see this is from the support knowledge database.
12 seconds later.
So that's the end of this update. But every day on Twitter and LinkedIn, giving updates throughout the day as I continue the sprint. I'll catch you tomorrow for the next day of the AI sprint.